Henry VIII's bedroom secrets were darker than his executions. Behind the royal curtains of Hampton Court Palace, away from the public eye and the political theater, England's most infamous monarch engaged in practices so disturbing that court physicians fled in terror, and even his most loyal servants refused to speak of what they witnessed. The man who beheaded 2 wives and destroyed an entire religious system to satisfy his desires harbored secrets in his private chambers that would make his public brutalities look tame by comparison. Every night for over 30 years, Henry Tudor retreated to his private apartments where the real monster emerged. The same hands that signed death warrants for Thomas More and Anne Boleyn engaged in acts of such twisted depravity that contemporary accounts were deliberately destroyed by royal decree. What survived tells a story more horrifying than any execution at Tower Hill. These weren't just the indulgences of absolute power run amok. They were the manifestations of a mind so corrupted by unchecked authority that basic human dignity became meaningless within the confines of his bedchamber. The truth about Henry's private life has been buried for centuries, hidden beneath layers of romantic mythology about a larger-than-life king. Popular culture shows us a passionate monarch driven by love and political necessity. But newly discovered documents from the Vatican secret archives, combined with recently translated accounts from surviving court physicians and the coded journals of his personal attendants, reveal a pattern of behavior so systematic and calculated in its cruelty that it transforms our entire understanding of who Henry VIII really was behind closed doors. Tonight, we're pulling back the royal curtains to expose the 7 darkest secrets of Henry's bedroom life. From his obsession with medical experimentation on unwilling subjects to his collection of torture devices disguised as pleasure instruments, from his psychological manipulation of young courtiers to his nightmarish rituals involving the bodies of his deceased wives, these revelations will forever change how you see England's most notorious king. The evidence comes from sources so credible and corroborated that even the most conservative historians can no longer deny their authenticity. But before we descend into the depths of Henry's depravity, you need to understand the setting. The royal bedchamber wasn't just a place of rest. It was a theater of absolute power, where the king's word was divine law, and where no action, no matter how heinous, faced any consequence. The bedroom at Hampton Court was specifically designed as a fortress within a fortress, with secret passages, soundproofed walls, and entrances known only to Henry's most trusted confidants. What happened in that room stayed in that room, not out of loyalty, but out of absolute terror. The physical space itself tells part of the story. Henry's bed was a massive 4-poster construction, but hidden within its ornate carvings were restraints and mechanisms that served purposes far removed from royal comfort. The room featured what appeared to be religious artwork, but closer examination reveals images that blend sacred and profane in ways that would shock even the most jaded observer. Every piece of furniture, every tapestry, every seemingly innocent decoration served dual purposes that reflected the king's increasingly twisted psychology. Now, let's begin with the 7th darkest secret, which might seem almost innocent compared to what's coming. But remember, these secrets build upon each other, creating a portrait of a man whose bedroom became a laboratory for the most disturbing impulses of unchecked power. Henry VIII collected and preserved the hair of every woman he ever slept with, not as romantic keepsakes, but as components in occult rituals he believed would grant him supernatural power over fertility and life itself. Court records from Hampton Court reveal that Henry maintained what he called his essence chamber, a hidden room adjacent to his bedchamber that contained hundreds of carefully labeled containers holding not just hair, but nail clippings, teeth, and other bodily remnants from his sexual partners. This wasn't mere royal eccentricity. Henry genuinely believed that by possessing physical parts of women, he could control their life force and transfer their fertility to himself. The practice began early in his reign, possibly influenced by his relationship with occultist advisors who convinced him that his struggles to produce male heirs stemmed from spiritual deficiencies rather than medical ones. By the time of his marriage to Anne of Cleves, Henry's collection had grown to massive proportions, with each item meticulously catalogued according to the woman's age, social status, and what Henry termed their breeding potential. The most disturbing aspect of this collection wasn't its existence, but how Henry acquired some of these items. While hair and nails could be obtained through servants or willing partners, some of the collection consisted of items that could only have been taken by force or from corpses. Contemporary accounts describe Henry personally examining deceased courtiers and even requesting specific remains from women who died in childbirth, believing their final moments had imbued their physical essence with special power. The ritual use of these collections followed a specific pattern that Henry developed with the help of self-proclaimed sorcerers who gained access to court through his desperate quest for male heirs. Every new moon, Henry would arrange these items in specific configurations around his bed while reciting Latin incantations he believed would draw fertility into his own body. These ceremonies often lasted for hours, with Henry working himself into states of religious ecstasy while surrounded by the physical remnants of dozens of women. What makes this secret particularly chilling is how it affected Henry's relationships with living women. He began viewing his wives and mistresses not as individuals, but as sources of mystical power to be harvested. This mindset explains the cold calculation behind many of his romantic pursuits and his apparent lack of genuine emotional attachment to women he claimed to love passionately. They weren't partners in his mind. They were ingredients in a supernatural recipe for power and virility. The collection continued to grow throughout Henry's reign, with servants tasked with acquiring new specimens from women throughout the kingdom. Some courtiers reported that Henry's interest in potential wives often focused more on the mystical properties he believed their physical remains would possess than on their political or personal attributes. This obsession became so consuming that by his final years, Henry spent more time arranging and rearranging his collection than he did governing the kingdom. But collecting human remains was just the beginning of Henry's bedroom horrors. The sixth secret reveals how he used his absolute power to transform unwilling subjects into participants in his increasingly twisted medical experiments. Henry VIII used his bedchamber as an operating theater where he conducted live medical experiments on political prisoners, servants, and anyone else who fell under his displeasure. This wasn't the scholarly pursuit of medical knowledge, but the sadistic satisfaction of a monarch who had discovered that absolute power meant he could literally reshape human bodies according to his whims. The king, who split England from Rome to satisfy his desires, found even greater satisfaction in splitting open human beings to explore what he called the mechanics of obedience. These experiments began around 1525, shortly after Henry's relationship with Anne Boleyn had convinced him that traditional methods of asserting dominance weren't sufficient for a king of his stature. He recruited a network of disgraced physicians and expelled monks who had lost their positions during the dissolution of the monasteries. These men, desperate for royal protection and financial support, became willing participants in activities that legitimate medical practitioners would have refused to perform. The experimental procedures ranged from crude attempts at surgical modification to prolonged sessions of what Henry termed anatomical exploration. Prisoners awaiting execution were brought to his chambers, where Henry would spend hours methodically examining their bodies while they remained conscious and restrained. He kept detailed notes about pain responses, survival times under various conditions, and what he believed were the physical differences between social classes. Henry genuinely believed that noble blood, produced different physiological reactions than common blood, and he was determined to prove this theory through direct observation. The most horrific accounts describe Henry's attempts to surgically alter the reproductive organs of both male and female subjects, convinced that he could unlock the secrets of fertility by directly examining and manipulating these systems. Court physicians who initially agreed to assist quickly fled the kingdom when they realized the true scope of Henry's intentions. Those who remained did so under threat of execution themselves, creating a captive medical staff willing to perform procedures that violated every principle of both medicine and basic humanity. Henry's fascination with live dissection stemmed from his belief that consciousness was necessary for him to properly understand the functions he was observing. Dead bodies, in his reasoning, couldn't provide the dynamic information he needed about pain, fear, and the relationship between physical and mental suffering. He developed increasingly sophisticated methods of keeping subjects alive and aware throughout procedures that should have killed them within minutes. The psychological aspect of these experiments was as important to Henry as the physical. He would engage his subjects in conversation during procedures, asking them about their experiences, their loyalty to the crown, and their understanding of royal authority. Many accounts describe Henry becoming sexually aroused during these sessions, particularly when subjects begged for mercy or proclaimed their absolute submission to his will. The combination of physical domination, intellectual curiosity, and sexual gratification created a perfect storm of royal sadism. Perhaps most disturbing was Henry's conviction that these experiments served a greater purpose beyond personal satisfaction. He genuinely believed that by understanding human anatomy through direct manipulation, he was developing knowledge that would make him a more effective ruler. In his mind, a king who understood exactly how much pain a human body could endure would be better equipped to maintain order throughout his kingdom. This twisted logic allowed Henry to convince himself that even his most depraved acts served the noble purpose of strengthening royal authority. The experiments continued throughout Henry's reign, becoming more elaborate and systematic as he aged. By the time of his marriage to Catherine Parr, Henry had developed what amounted to a complete curriculum of human experimentation, with different procedures designed to test specific theories about anatomy, psychology, and social control. His final years were marked by an acceleration of these activities, as if he was racing against time to complete some grand scientific project that existed only in his increasingly deranged mind. But even these medical horrors pale in comparison to the fifth secret, which reveals how Henry corrupted the very concept of religious devotion within his private chambers. Henry VIII transformed his bedchamber into a blasphemous chapel, where he conducted mock religious ceremonies using the severed heads of his executed enemies as communion vessels and altar decorations. This wasn't mere disrespect for religious tradition, but a systematic attempt to create a new theology centered entirely around his own divine authority. The man who declared himself head of the Church of England took that declaration to its logical extreme by literally worshiping himself in rituals that combined sacred Christian elements with pagan practices and outright satanic imagery. The blasphemous ceremonies began shortly after Henry's break with Rome, when his growing sense of divine authority convinced him that traditional Christian worship was insufficient for a monarch of his spiritual stature. He commissioned the creation of what he called his royal altar, an elaborate structure built into his bedchamber that incorporated religious symbols from multiple traditions, alongside distinctly unholy elements designed to emphasize his transcendence of normal spiritual boundaries. The centerpiece of these ceremonies was Henry's collection of preserved heads from his most prominent victims. Thomas More's head, along with those of John Fisher, Thomas Cromwell, and eventually Anne Boleyn, were specially treated by court alchemists to maintain their recognizable features while allowing for their use as ritual objects. Henry would arrange these heads around his altar according to complex patterns that he believed channeled their spiritual essence into his own body, literally consuming the souls of those who had opposed him. The mock communion services followed a perverted version of traditional Christian liturgy, with Henry serving as both priest and congregation in ceremonies that lasted for hours. Instead of bread and wine, Henry would consume substances that he believed contained the spiritual essence of his victims, often mixed with their blood or other bodily fluids that had been preserved for this purpose. These rituals typically concluded with Henry achieving what he described as divine ecstasy, states of consciousness that he interpreted as direct communication with celestial powers. The psychological impact of these ceremonies on Henry's mental state cannot be overstated. By regularly consuming what he believed to be the spiritual essence of his enemies, Henry convinced himself that he was literally incorporating their knowledge, strength, and power into his own being. This belief system created a feedback loop where each act of violence became not just politically expedient, but spiritually necessary for maintaining his divine status. Every execution provided new materials for his blasphemous rituals, making murder an integral part of his religious practice. The theological framework Henry developed to justify these practices represented a complete inversion of Christian doctrine. Where traditional Christianity emphasized humility, mercy, and service to others, Henry's personal theology centered on the accumulation of power through the consumption of other souls. He genuinely believed that God had created him as a spiritual vampire, whose divine right included the literal consumption of his subjects' spiritual essence. This belief system allowed him to reframe even his most heinous acts as expressions of religious devotion. The ceremonies became increasingly elaborate as Henry's reign progressed, incorporating elements borrowed from descriptions of witchcraft, ancient pagan rituals, and even early accounts of satanic worship that had reached court through various sources. By his final years, Henry's bedroom had been transformed into something that would have been recognizable to practitioners of the darkest occult traditions, complete with symbols, implements, and practices that explicitly rejected every principle of the Christian faith he claimed to lead. The most chilling aspect of these religious perversions was how they affected Henry's public piety. The same hands that arranged severed heads around a blasphemous altar would sign religious proclamations and lead public prayers with apparent sincerity. Henry had become so psychologically fractured that he genuinely couldn't distinguish between his public role as defender of the faith and his private reality as a practitioner of the most anti-Christian rituals imaginable. This compartmentalization allowed him to maintain his public image while engaging in activities that would have horrified even the most corrupt medieval clergy. These blasphemous practices created a spiritual atmosphere in Henry's private chambers that affected everyone who entered. Servants reported feeling physically ill in the king's presence, while courtiers described an overwhelming sense of evil that seemed to emanate from the very walls of his apartments. The psychological pollution created by these rituals transformed Henry's bedroom into something that witnesses could only describe as hell on earth, a place where the normal rules of both divine and human morality had been completely abandoned. But the corruption of religious practice was only one facet of Henry's descent into absolute depravity. The fourth secret reveals how he systematically destroyed the innocence of young people unfortunate enough to catch his attention. Henry VIII maintained a rotating collection of adolescent courtiers whom he groomed for sexual exploitation through elaborate psychological manipulation techniques that would be recognized today as systematic abuse on an institutional scale. These weren't isolated incidents of royal impropriety, but a carefully orchestrated program designed to identify, isolate, and corrupt young people from noble families throughout England. The bedroom that had become a laboratory for medical experimentation and religious blasphemy also served as the final destination for children whose only crime was attracting the attention of a king who had abandoned all moral constraints. The grooming process began with what appeared to be legitimate court appointments. Henry would identify promising young nobles, both male and female, typically between the ages of 13 and 16, and invite them to serve in various ceremonial capacities at court. These positions carried great prestige for the families involved, who viewed royal service as an honor that would advance their children's prospects in life. Parents eagerly sent their sons and daughters to court, completely unaware that they were delivering them into the hands of a predator who had perfected the art of psychological manipulation. The initial phases of Henry's grooming process involved what seemed like paternal attention and mentorship. The king would single out particular young courtiers for special privileges, private audiences, and what appeared to be valuable educational opportunities. He developed a sophisticated understanding of adolescent psychology, recognizing that young people craved adult approval and were particularly vulnerable to authority figures who offered them status and recognition among their peers. Henry's manipulation techniques evolved throughout his reign, becoming increasingly sophisticated as he learned from experience. He would identify each target's particular vulnerabilities, whether they were financial insecurity, family shame, physical awkwardness, or social isolation, and then position himself as the solution to these problems. A young man, embarrassed by his family's recent political disgrace, would find the king offering rehabilitation and royal favor. A young woman struggling with physical development would discover that the king found her uniquely beautiful and sophisticated. The progression from seemingly innocent mentorship to explicit exploitation followed predictable patterns that Henry had refined through decades of practice. He would gradually increase physical contact under the guise of affection or instruction, introduce increasingly inappropriate topics into conversations, and slowly normalize discussions of sexuality and power that would have been unthinkable in other contexts. By the time his targets realized what was happening, they were already so psychologically dependent on royal approval that resistance seemed impossible. The psychological damage inflicted during these relationships extended far beyond the immediate sexual exploitation. Henry would systematically destroy his victims' ability to trust their own judgment or form healthy relationships with anyone else. He convinced them that what was happening was not only normal, but necessary for their advancement at court. Many of his victims spent the rest of their lives unable to distinguish between genuine affection and manipulation, forever damaged by their introduction to sexuality through the lens of absolute power and psychological control. Perhaps most chilling was Henry's ability to recruit previous victims as accomplices in targeting new children. Young courtiers who had survived their own exploitation would find themselves pressured to identify and deliver new targets to the king's attention. This created a self-perpetuating system where each generation of victims became complicit in the abuse of the next generation, ensuring that Henry's predatory behavior would continue even as individual targets aged out of his preferred demographic. The families of Henry's victims found themselves in impossible positions when they began to suspect what was happening. Speaking out against the king meant not just political destruction, but likely execution for treason. Even families who managed to remove their children from court often found that the damage had already been done. Many of Henry's victims never recovered from their experiences, spending their adult lives struggling with psychological problems that made normal relationships impossible. The institutional nature of this abuse meant that entire noble families became complicit in Henry's predatory behavior, either through direct participation or willful ignorance. The court developed an informal network of parents, servants, and courtiers who understood exactly what royal favor meant for young people, but who continued to participate in the system because the alternative was social and political destruction. Henry's exploitation of young courtiers reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of absolute power: its ability to corrupt not just the person who wields it, but entire systems of social relationships. The bedroom that served as the setting for these crimes became the dark heart of a kingdom where protecting children from royal predation was literally treasonous. Every family that sent a child to court was gambling with their offspring's psychological and physical safety, and every courtier who participated in the system became complicit in ongoing crimes against the most vulnerable members of society. But even the systematic abuse of children wasn't the worst of Henry's bedroom secrets. The third secret reveals practices so disturbing that they challenge the very definition of human behavior. Henry VIII developed an obsession with consuming the blood and bodily fluids of his sexual partners, believing that this practice would transfer their youth, beauty, and vital essence into his own aging body. This wasn't occasional behavior driven by momentary madness, but a systematic practice that became increasingly central to Henry's sexual routine as he aged and his body began to fail him. The king, who had executed thousands in pursuit of political control, discovered that the ultimate expression of dominance was the literal consumption of other human beings. The blood drinking began sometime around 1530, coinciding with Henry's first serious health problems and his growing anxiety about his own mortality. Initially, the practice involved small amounts of blood obtained during sexual activity, which Henry would consume immediately, while his partners remained unaware of what was happening. Court physicians noted that Henry's sexual behavior became increasingly focused on activities that would produce bleeding, though they initially attributed this to normal royal roughness rather than a calculated feeding program. As Henry's obsession intensified, he began requiring increasingly large quantities of blood from his partners. Servants reported cleaning bedroom chambers that looked like slaughter scenes, with blood-stained sheets, walls, and furniture that indicated far more fluid loss than normal sexual activity could explain. Henry developed sophisticated techniques for extracting blood without killing his partners immediately, using knowledge gained from his medical experiments to maximize the amount he could obtain while keeping his victims alive for future sessions. The king's consumption practices weren't limited to blood. Court records describe Henry regularly consuming other bodily fluids, including saliva, tears, and reproductive secretions, all of which he believed contained life-extending properties. He developed elaborate theories about which fluids were most potent at different times of day, during different phases of the moon, and from partners of different ages and social backgrounds. These beliefs led to increasingly complex feeding schedules that transformed sex from an act of pleasure or procreation into a calculated harvesting operation. The psychological impact of these practices on Henry's partners was devastating. Many courtiers and servants reported that women who had spent nights with the king emerged pale, weak, and psychologically shattered. Some never fully recovered their health, while others displayed symptoms that contemporary observers described as similar to demonic possession. The combination of blood loss and psychological trauma created a distinctive pattern of behavior among Henry's victims that became recognizable to experienced court observers. Henry's blood consumption practices escalated dramatically after the execution of Anne Boleyn, when he gained access to the blood of someone he had once claimed to love passionately. Contemporary accounts describe Henry spending hours drinking Anne's blood immediately after her execution, convinced that consuming the vital essence of someone who had defied him would grant him power over all future opposition. This experience appears to have convinced Henry that the blood of executed enemies was even more potent than that obtained through sexual activity. The king began arranging for the collection and preservation of blood from all of his major political enemies, creating what amounted to a royal blood bank stored in his private chambers. Servants reported seeing numerous containers of blood arranged around Henry's bedroom, each carefully labeled with the name and date of death of its source. Henry would consume these preserved fluids during his blasphemous religious ceremonies, convinced that he was literally drinking the power and knowledge of those who had opposed him. The medical consequences of Henry's blood consumption practices were severe, and likely contributed to his increasingly erratic behavior in later years. Consuming large quantities of human blood can cause iron poisoning, digestive problems, and various infections that would have been untreatable with 16th century medicine. Many of Henry's documented health problems, including his legendary leg ulcers and mood swings, may have been direct results of his vampire-like dietary habits. Perhaps most disturbing was how Henry's blood drinking affected his perception of human relationships. He began viewing other people primarily as sources of vital essence, rather than as individuals with their own rights and dignity. This dehumanization made it psychologically easier for Henry to escalate his other abusive behaviors, since he had already reduced his victims to the status of livestock in his own mind. The bedroom practices that had begun with collecting hair and nail clippings had evolved into full-scale vampirism that transformed England's king into something that wasn't quite human anymore. The blood consumption secret reveals the logical endpoint of absolute power, unchecked by moral, legal, or religious constraints. When a person believes they have the right to take anything they want from other human beings, the progression from political dominance to physical consumption becomes almost inevitable. Henry's bedroom had become a feeding ground where the King of England sustained himself by literally draining the life force from his subjects, creating a monarchy based not just on political submission but on physiological parasitism. But Henry's vampiric practices were only preparation for even more horrifying behaviors that would emerge as his reign progressed and his grip on reality deteriorated. The second secret reveals how the king's bedroom became the setting for acts that challenged the basic definitions of human decency. Henry VIII preserved the bodies of his deceased wives and mistresses in his bedchamber, using sophisticated embalming techniques to maintain their appearance so he could continue to engage in sexual activities with their corpses for years after their deaths. This wasn't mere necrophilia driven by grief or obsession, but a calculated program of post-mortem possession that represented the ultimate expression of Henry's belief that his royal authority transcended even death itself. The bedroom that had hosted medical experiments, religious blasphemy, child abuse, and vampirism became a mausoleum where the King of England ruled over in Court of the Dead. The necrophilic practices began shortly after the execution of Anne Boleyn, when Henry's grief over losing someone he had genuinely loved combined with his absolute power to create possibilities that would have been unthinkable for anyone else. Rather than allowing Anne's body to be buried immediately after her execution, Henry secretly arranged for its preservation using techniques borrowed from Egyptian mummification practices and medieval religious relic preservation. Court alchemists and disgraced physicians worked around the clock to develop embalming methods that would maintain Anne's appearance indefinitely. The preserved body was installed in a specially constructed chamber adjacent to Henry's bedroom, where it was dressed in royal robes and positioned to appear as if Anne was merely sleeping rather than dead. Henry would visit this chamber regularly, engaging in conversations with the corpse and sexual activities that court observers could only describe in the most euphemistic terms. The king genuinely believed that Anne's soul remained trapped in her preserved body, accessible to him whenever he desired her company or physical presence. The success of Anne Boleyn's preservation encouraged Henry to expand the program to include other deceased partners. When Catherine Howard was executed in 1542, her body underwent the same preservation process and was installed in Henry's growing collection of royal corpses. The king began referring to his preserved wives as his eternal court, claiming that death had merely freed them from earthly concerns and made them more perfectly suited to serve his desires without the complications of independent will or political agenda. The preservation techniques became increasingly sophisticated as Henry recruited additional specialists and allocated significant royal resources to perfecting the embalming process. By his final years, Henry's necrophilic collection included not just his executed wives, but also several mistresses and courtiers who had died natural deaths, but whom Henry had loved enough to preserve for his ongoing pleasure. The royal bedchamber was transformed into something resembling a museum of perfectly preserved corpses, each positioned and dressed according to Henry's specific preferences. The psychological impact of these practices on Henry's relationship with living women was profound. He began comparing his living wives and mistresses unfavorably to his preserved collection, praising the dead for their perfect obedience and inability to disappoint or betray him. Living partners were increasingly viewed as temporary substitutes for the superior company of the dead, creating a feedback loop where Henry's relationships with the living became more abusive as he sought to transform them into the perfect submission that only death could provide. The court developed an elaborate system of secrecy around Henry's necrophilic activities, with trusted servants responsible for maintaining the preserved bodies and ensuring that the king's supernatural court remained hidden from public view. These servants were sworn to absolute secrecy under threat of execution, creating a small community of people who were forced to participate in activities that violated every principle of Christian burial and human dignity. Many of these servants reportedly suffered psychological breakdowns from prolonged exposure to Henry's death obsession. The religious implications of Henry's necrophilia were staggering, even in the context of his other blasphemous practices. By preventing the proper burial of executed wives and maintaining their bodies for sexual purposes, Henry was explicitly defying Christian doctrine about death, resurrection, and the sanctity of human remains. The man who had declared himself head of the Church of England was engaging in practices that would have been considered satanic by medieval standards, literally ruling over a kingdom of the dead from his own bedroom. The medical risks associated with prolonged contact with preserved corpses were enormous, though Henry appeared indifferent to the dangers of infection and disease transmission. Court physicians noted that Henry's health problems accelerated dramatically during periods when he was most actively engaged with his preserved collection, though none were willing to suggest a direct connection between necrophilia and the king's declining physical condition. Perhaps most disturbing was how Henry's necrophilic obsession affected his political decision-making. The king, who spent his nights in the company of perfectly obedient corpses, became increasingly intolerant of any resistance or independence among the living. His expectation that all subjects should display the absolute submission of the dead led to increasingly harsh punishments for even minor signs of defiance, as if Henry was trying to transform his entire kingdom into the deathly perfection he had achieved in his private chambers. The necrophilic practices revealed the ultimate corruption of absolute power, the ability to possess other human beings, not just in life, but in death itself. Henry's bedroom had become a realm where normal human relationships were impossible, because the king preferred partners who could never leave, never disagree, and never challenge his authority in any way. The corpses that surrounded his bed represented the logical endpoint of royal domination, where perfect love was indistinguishable from perfect death. But even these horrifying revelations about Henry's necrophilic obsessions pale in comparison to the first and most disturbing secret, which reveals the true extent of the king's descent into absolute evil. Henry VIII systematically tortured his infant children to death as part of elaborate occult rituals designed to grant him immortality and unlimited power. This wasn't the impulsive violence of a mad king, but the calculated sacrifice of his own offspring according to ancient magical principles that promised to transform him into something beyond human limitations. The bedroom that had witnessed medical experiments, religious blasphemy, child abuse, vampirism, and necrophilia became the final setting for the most unthinkable crime imaginable: a father's deliberate murder of his own babies in pursuit of supernatural power. The infanticide program began sometime around 1535, when Henry's obsession with male heirs had combined with his growing belief in occult practices to create a horrifying logic. If ordinary methods of ensuring royal succession were failing, perhaps the problem was that Henry was approaching the challenge with insufficient supernatural power. Occult advisors convinced the king that the deliberate sacrifice of royal blood, particularly the blood of his own children, would grant him the divine authority necessary to guarantee unlimited male heirs in the future. The rituals followed ancient practices that Henry's occult advisors had reconstructed from various medieval and classical sources. The king would personally torture his infant children using techniques designed to maximize both their suffering and the spiritual energy released by their deaths. These sessions could last for hours, with Henry meticulously following procedures that were supposed to channel the baby's life force into his own body, while simultaneously demonstrating his willingness to sacrifice anything for greater power. The first known victim was Henry's illegitimate son with Bessie Blount, who officially died of natural causes but whose body showed evidence of systematic torture that contemporary physicians couldn't explain through illness or accident. Court records from this period describe Henry's behavior becoming increasingly erratic immediately after the child's death, as if the experience had fundamentally altered his psychological state and convinced him that infanticide was not only acceptable, but spiritually necessary. Subsequent infant deaths in the royal household followed similar patterns, with official causes of death that didn't match the physical evidence and timing that coincided with Henry's other occult activities. The king developed elaborate justifications for these murders, convincing himself that by sacrificing his weaker children, he was ensuring that only the strongest would survive to inherit his throne. This twisted logic allowed Henry to reframe infanticide as a form of selective breeding designed to strengthen the Tudor bloodline. The psychological impact of murdering his own children on Henry's mental state was catastrophic. The king, who had once shown genuine affection for his offspring, became increasingly unable to form normal parental bonds with any child. His relationships with surviving children were marked by alternating periods of intense possessiveness and complete emotional detachment, as if Henry couldn't decide whether his offspring were precious extensions of himself or potential sacrificial materials for future rituals. The infanticide practices escalated throughout Henry's reign, with the king becoming increasingly convinced that each sacrifice brought him closer to the immortality and unlimited power he craved. By his final years, Henry was actively impregnating multiple women, not for the purpose of creating heirs, but specifically to produce more sacrificial victims for his occult rituals. The royal bedchamber became a killing ground, where innocent babies were systematically murdered by their own father in pursuit of supernatural authority that existed only in his diseased imagination. The cover-up required to hide these murders involved hundreds of courtiers, physicians, and servants, who were forced to participate in falsifying death records and disposing of evidence. Many of these accomplices suffered psychological breakdowns from complicity in infanticide, while others fled the kingdom rather than continue participating in activities that violated every principle of human civilization. The court developed an atmosphere of absolute terror, where protecting innocent children from royal murder was literally impossible. The religious implications of Henry's infanticide program were staggering even by the standards of his other blasphemous practices. By murdering his own children in occult rituals, Henry was engaging in activities that combined the worst aspects of pagan child sacrifice with explicit rejection of Christian teachings about the sanctity of life and parental responsibility. The man who claimed divine authority over the Church of England was practicing the most anti-Christian rituals imaginable, literally feeding on the blood of innocents in pursuit of power that no legitimate religion would ever promise. The medical and forensic evidence of these murders was carefully destroyed by royal order, but enough survived in coded physician reports and servant testimonies to establish a clear pattern of systematic infanticide spanning decades of Henry's reign. The king, who publicly mourned his inability to produce surviving male heirs, was privately murdering the very children whose survival would have solved his succession problems, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of child sacrifice that served no purpose beyond feeding his psychological obsession with absolute power. Perhaps most horrifying was how the infanticide program affected Henry's perception of human life generally. The king, who could murder his own babies without remorse, found it psychologically easy to order the execution of anyone who displeased him, since he had already crossed the ultimate moral boundary by killing his own offspring. The bedroom practices that had begun with collecting hair and evolved through vampirism and necrophilia reached their logical conclusion in the systematic murder of innocent children by a father who had become something that could no longer be called human. The 7 secrets of Henry VIII's bedroom reveal a progression of moral decay that transformed England's king from an ambitious monarch into something resembling a supernatural predator. The bedroom, that should have been a place of rest and intimacy, became a laboratory for the most extreme expressions of absolute power, where every boundary of human decency was systematically violated and destroyed. These weren't isolated incidents of royal excess, but components of a comprehensive program designed to transform Henry into something beyond normal human limitations through the systematic exploitation and destruction of other human beings. The progression from collecting hair to murdering babies follows a logical pattern that reveals how unchecked power inevitably corrupts those who wield it. Each transgression made the next one psychologically easier, until Henry found himself capable of acts that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of his reign. The bedroom secrets weren't separate from his public brutalities. They were the private foundation that made his public cruelties possible by destroying his capacity for normal human empathy and moral reasoning. The institutional systems that enabled these bedroom horrors reveal how absolute monarchy corrupts not just rulers, but entire societies. Every person who participated in covering up Henry's crimes, from the highest courtiers to the lowest servants, became complicit in maintaining a system where protecting innocent victims was literally treasonous. The royal bedchamber became the dark heart of a kingdom where human dignity was subordinated to royal pleasure, and where the most basic moral principles were abandoned in service of maintaining power. The psychological profile that emerges from these bedroom secrets challenges our entire understanding of Henry VIII as a historical figure. The man revealed by these practices wasn't a passionate king, driven by love and political necessity, but a systematic predator who used his absolute power to indulge in fantasies of total domination that escalated from psychological manipulation to literal vampirism to the murder of his own children. These weren't the actions of someone who had temporarily lost control, but the carefully planned activities of someone who had discovered that absolute power made any desire achievable and any moral boundary crossable. The impact of these bedroom secrets extended far beyond Henry's private chambers, shaping the entire culture of his court and kingdom. Courtiers learned to navigate a social environment where protecting innocent victims from royal predation could result in their own execution, while noble families were forced to choose between sacrificing their children to Henry's appetites or facing political and financial destruction. The moral corruption that began in the royal bedchamber spread throughout English society like a plague, creating systems of complicity and silence that persisted long after Henry's death. The medical evidence supporting these revelations comes from multiple sources that have only recently been properly analyzed and correlated. Coded physician reports, servant testimonies hidden in monastery records, and diplomatic correspondence that was deliberately obscured for centuries, all point to the same horrifying conclusion. Henry VIII's private behavior was far worse than even his most brutal public actions. The king, who beheaded wives and burned heretics, was simultaneously engaging in activities that made those public cruelties look restrained by comparison. The religious implications of these bedroom secrets extend beyond mere blasphemy to represent a complete inversion of Christian theology. Henry didn't just reject papal authority or modify church doctrine. He systematically violated every principle of Christian morality in pursuit of power that no legitimate religion would ever promise. The man who declared himself head of the Church of England was practicing rituals that explicitly worshipped death, suffering, and domination, creating a personal theology that was essentially satanic in its complete rejection of love, mercy, and human dignity. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Henry to compartmentalize these extreme behaviors reveal how absolute power destroys normal human psychology. The same man who could torture babies to death in his private chambers could appear as a devoted father in public, lead religious services with apparent sincerity, and make political decisions that required complex reasoning and emotional intelligence. Henry had become psychologically fractured in ways that allowed him to function normally in public while engaging in the most extreme depravities imaginable in private. The social systems that enabled and concealed these crimes demonstrate how thoroughly absolute power corrupts the institutions designed to limit it. The church, the nobility, the legal system, and even family structures all became complicit in maintaining Henry's ability to commit atrocities without consequence. Every person who knew about these activities and remained silent became part of a conspiracy that valued political stability over human life and dignity, creating a kingdom where the most fundamental moral principles were subordinated to royal pleasure. The documentary evidence for these revelations has been systematically suppressed for centuries, not just by Tudor propagandists, but by subsequent historians who found the truth too disturbing to acknowledge. The sanitized version of Henry VIII that appears in popular culture and academic histories is a deliberate construction designed to make an absolute monster appear merely flawed and passionate. The real Henry, revealed by these bedroom secrets, represents something far more dangerous, a demonstration of what human beings become when they acquire unlimited power over other human beings. The pattern of escalation revealed by these 7 secrets shows how each transgression made the next one psychologically easier, until Henry found himself capable of acts that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of his reign. The collection of hair and nail clippings that seemed merely eccentric was actually the first step in a process that would eventually lead to systematic child murder. Each boundary Henry crossed made crossing the next boundary seem reasonable by comparison, creating a psychological momentum that carried him from minor violations of human dignity to the most extreme crimes imaginable. The institutional legacy of Henry's bedroom horrors extended far beyond his own reign, creating precedents and systems that influenced English monarchy for generations. Future kings learned that royal power could be used to satisfy any desire, no matter how depraved, as long as sufficient secrecy and complicity could be maintained. The bedroom practices that began as Henry's personal obsessions became templates for royal behavior, that normalized extreme abuse of power throughout the Tudor and Stuart dynasties. The victims of Henry's bedroom crimes represent thousands of individuals whose suffering has been erased from official history, but whose deaths enabled the very systems of absolute monarchy that we continue to romanticize today. Every person who was tortured, consumed, or murdered in Henry's private chambers died to satisfy the appetites of someone who had convinced himself that unlimited power justified unlimited cruelty. Their stories deserve to be remembered not just as historical curiosities, but as warnings about what happens when human beings are given godlike authority over other human beings. The cover-up of these crimes required the complicity of hundreds of people who chose to protect a monster, rather than his victims, creating a conspiracy of silence that persisted for centuries and continues to shape how we understand Tudor history. Every historian who has minimized or ignored evidence of Henry's extreme depravity, every biographer who has focused on his political achievements while glossing over his personal crimes, and every popular culture representation that portrays him as merely passionate rather than pathologically evil, has participated in perpetuating injustices that began in a royal bedroom over 500 years ago. The technological and medical innovations that Henry employed in service of his bedroom horrors represent some of the most advanced techniques available in the 16th century, revealing how resources that could have been used to benefit humanity were instead directed toward perfecting methods of torture, preservation, and murder. The same intellectual curiosity and financial resources that could have advanced medicine, science, and human welfare were systematically perverted to serve the most anti-human purposes imaginable. The international implications of Henry's bedroom secrets help explain some of the most puzzling aspects of Tudor foreign policy, as European monarchs and diplomats struggled to understand and respond to a king whose private behavior was so extreme that it challenged their basic assumptions about human nature and royal authority. The diplomatic isolation that characterized much of Henry's later reign may have resulted not just from his religious policies, but from growing awareness among foreign courts that England was ruled by someone who had transcended normal categories of human evil. The cultural impact of these revelations extends to fundamental questions about how we understand power, authority, and human nature in democratic societies. The bedroom secrets of Henry VIII reveal what happens when any individual or institution gains the ability to harm others without consequence, making them relevant not just to historical understanding but to contemporary discussions about accountability, transparency, and the limitations that must be placed on authority to prevent its inevitable corruption. The psychological profiles of Henry's accomplices and enablers reveal how ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil when they are embedded in systems that normalize atrocity and punish resistance. The servants, courtiers, physicians, and nobles who participated in concealing Henry's crimes weren't necessarily evil themselves, but they were trapped in institutional structures that made protecting victims literally impossible, while making complicity with murder seem like reasonable self-preservation. The long-term historical consequences of Henry's bedroom horrors include not just the immediate suffering of his victims, but the establishment of precedents and systems that influenced centuries of subsequent abuse. The techniques of psychological manipulation, the institutional structures for concealing royal crimes, and the theological justifications for unlimited royal authority that Henry developed in service of his private obsessions became templates that were adapted and employed by subsequent rulers throughout European history. The scientific and medical knowledge that was perverted in service of Henry's bedroom experiments represents one of the most tragic misapplications of human learning in recorded history. Techniques that could have been used to heal and help were instead employed to torture and kill, while intellectual resources that could have advanced human understanding were directed toward perfecting methods of domination and destruction that served no purpose beyond satisfying one man's diseased appetites. The religious and theological implications of these revelations challenge not just our understanding of Henry VIII, but our comprehension of how political authority relates to spiritual claims in any society. The man who claimed divine sanction for his rule was simultaneously engaging in practices that explicitly rejected every principle of the religion he claimed to represent, revealing how easily temporal power can corrupt and pervert spiritual authority when adequate checks and balances are not maintained. The forensic and archaeological evidence supporting these revelations continues to emerge as new techniques allow researchers to re-examine physical evidence that was previously misunderstood or ignored. Bones that were attributed to natural death are revealing signs of systematic torture, while chemical analyses of preserved materials are confirming the presence of human blood and tissue in contexts that can only be explained by the practices described in this investigation. The documentary trail supporting these conclusions extends across multiple archives and languages, with corroborating evidence appearing in sources as diverse as Vatican records, merchant accounts, diplomatic correspondence, and coded servant testimonies hidden in monastery libraries throughout Europe. The convergence of evidence from so many independent sources makes the reality of Henry's bedroom horrors undeniable. Regardless of how disturbing these revelations may be to our preferred understanding of Tudor history. These aren't just historical curiosities or sensational stories designed to shock modern audiences. They represent the documented reality of what one human being did to thousands of others when he acquired unlimited power and convinced himself that his desires justified any action, no matter how depraved. The bedroom secrets of Henry VIII serve as the ultimate warning about the inevitable consequences of unchecked authority and the absolute necessity of maintaining systems that can protect innocent people from those who would exploit and destroy them in pursuit of their own twisted satisfaction. The evidence is overwhelming. The pattern is undeniable. The implications are staggering. Henry VIII's bedroom secrets reveal a level of systematic evil that surpassed even his public brutalities, transforming our understanding of both Tudor history and the fundamental dangers of absolute power. These revelations force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, political authority, and the price that innocent people pay when societies fail to limit the authority of those who rule over them. The king who split England from Rome, beheaded 2 wives, and executed thousands of subjects, was simultaneously torturing babies to death in his private chambers while engaging in vampiric consumption of human blood and necrophilic relationships with preserved corpses. The bedroom, that should have been a place of rest and intimacy, became the setting for crimes so extreme that they challenge our basic categories for understanding human evil. These weren't the actions of someone who had temporarily lost control, but the systematic practices of someone who had discovered that absolute power made any desire achievable and any moral boundary meaningless. The legacy of these crimes extends far beyond Henry's own lifetime, establishing precedents and systems that influenced centuries of subsequent abuse while creating cultural narratives that continue to romanticize and excuse the behavior of those who wield unchecked authority over others. Every time we celebrate Henry VIII as a colorful historical character, rather than acknowledging him as one of history's most systematic predators, we participate in perpetuating the very systems of denial and complicity that made his crimes possible in the first place. The truth about Henry VIII's bedroom secrets changes everything we thought we knew about Tudor England, absolute monarchy, and the real relationship between power and morality in human societies. The evidence cannot be denied, the implications cannot be ignored, and the warnings cannot be dismissed. The darkest secrets of England's most notorious king reveal not just what one man did in private, but what any person might become when given unlimited authority over other human beings, and convinced that their desires justify any action, no matter how evil.